Hello and welcome to an overview of GraphQL backend. This is going to take a look at GraphQL endpoints with Django and Graphene Django. And really I wanted to illustrate how easy it is to go from Django to a GraphQL endpoint. Taking a look at the end goal, this is what you want to input on the left from whatever your API call is. And then this is what I think is actually fantastic about GraphQL. A lot of people talk about the performance optimization and things like that. Honestly, I feel like the concise syntax is the biggest selling point of GraphQL. You put in some sort of call like on the left, and this is the data that gets spit out on the right. You can see how mapping over that is really easy and to create React objects at the end of the day. So quick review of Django models. If you are unfamiliar with Django, you've got char fields, Boolean fields, integer fields, basically anything you need to represent a database object or a general object type. Char fields, of course, being strings, Boolean fields being Booleans. I don't feel like I need to really go into that in depth. But there are some really fun specialized fields that are in Django. You have an email field, which will do email field correction for you and kind of do optimization around that. Or I should say validation around that. You have image fields for images, and my absolute favorite generic IP address fields for IP address checking. And the strength of this is if you really want to make toy DevOps things, or you want to make something that's available to, I don't know, your development group and also your QA group, but you want to have different things accessible to each group, you can even lock it down to the IP level or even display different things depending on what their IP address is, things like that. It's really fun. Anyway, looking at graphene field types, you have something that looks very similar. You have strings, ints, floats, booleans, IDs. IDs, by the way, are very important when you're working with relay. A little bit less important if you are not working with the relay specification. And I need to also emphasize that relay is both a Facebook client in the line of Apollo, but it's also a generalized specification that introduces nodes and things like that. I think I'll cover that in the next video as far as the differentiation between the two. I prefer to not use relay just to keep things, as far as the specification goes, just to keep things simple. But there are instances, particularly if you need high performance, where you're probably going to want relay, so just be aware of that. Anyway, there's also date times of the data objects, and then I want to make a special note on the JSON string. It's typically easier actually to just build a custom graphene object type when you're dealing with this. I ran into the trap where I was wanting something at the end that was JSON-ish, and I realized actually what I could have done is probably just built a object type and then data munged into it rather than having a JSON string coming back. When you have the JSON string returning to the client, they actually have to do some decoding, or I should say, encoding into a JSON object on the JavaScript side, which is kind of an extra step. It makes things a little bit uglier and more complicated. But just be aware of that. I'm sure there are use cases where it is absolutely necessary, but you can also basically just data munch things into a custom object type in Graphene, and you'll end up with something that looks, in my opinion, much cleaner. And I should probably go back and refactor some code, but I don't know if I'll get around to that. Anyway, comparisons. On the left, you have Django field types. On the right, you have the base scalars, or what they're called in Graphene. And you can see there's almost a one-to-one relationship here. Primary keys can go to Graphene IDs. You have char fields that can go to Graphene strings, so on and so forth, all the way down the line. Now, it would be nice if there was some sort of library that let you go directly from Django into Graphene like this. And I guess I'm here to tell you good news, there is. That's Graphene Django. And I think I might have called it Django-Graphene in the previous video. Apologies if I did. But it's built on top of Python Graphene. It ingests Django models and puts them directly into Graphene object types, which I'll illustrate in just a second. In many instances, it's that simple. That's all you really need to do. You can take the exact Django model, push it to Graphene, and you're done. And honestly, a lot of my code has been just that, which has sped up development drastically. And honestly, for everything else, you can just basically data munge into a custom Graphene object type, a little bit like I talked about in the previous slide. In the next video I produce, I will show a little bit of that, hopefully, or at least talk about that. This also makes it easier to simplify separation of concerns in the back end. So you have your database logic, and then you have how you want to display that to the front end. And sometimes those things don't align. And oftentimes what happens is individuals will therefore adjust their back-end schema, where they'll mess with the database and how the data is stored in order to make that a little bit more straightforward. And that creates problems because that's not always the most efficient way to store things in a database. That's also not necessarily the best way to represent the data for reporting, things like that. But with this, what you can do is you can have all your database logic in the models, and you can have all of the endpoint logic that's going out in your schema, or your schema.py, and I'll talk about that next. So all those things I was talking about as far as Django field types, that would go into your models.py, and that's really where I put your data-oriented logic. So if you're specifically for doing CRUD operations, if you need to display something different based on user, based on IP address, something along those lines, that's where I would argue you should put that logic. Not that I always do that, because it's been a learning process for me. On the right, that's where you put things in the schema.py, and that's where I would argue you want to put your endpoint-oriented logic, things you want to adjust to display to your end user. So let's go over an example and what that looks like. So in models.py, you can literally, this is a usable case, and I'll prove it at the end of this. You can create an example with Django model, and I'm just adding two very basic fields, char field, end field. Also, I want to caveat, I intentionally put in the underscore here because you'll see that whenever you put in an underscore with this particular library, this is one little quirk of it, is it casts it to uppercase. There is a option where you can tell it to not do that, at which point it's going to be spitting things out exactly with the underscore, but there's a little bit of, I'm not sure if it's sort of PEP 8-ish or if it's official syntax, but I think it's preferred syntax on the JavaScript GraphQL side to have things camel cased, but I'll let you guys make that decision. Anyway, that goes in your models.py. On schema.py, we go ahead and import that model, and you can see we just create a Django object type, which is what we get from Graphene Django. And basically all this is doing is this is saying, you usually want this in Graphene at large, is you're just saying this is the type of data that I'm going to be spitting out at the end of the day. That's what's going to end up in the at the display view. And what this does with that meta class is it actually reads what's coming in the model, and it just automatically creates those fields for you. It takes all of the fields that are in that model and preps them for display. And then in class query, I've created essentially what's going to be the call at the end of the day for GraphQL, which is all example. Again, that's going to, whenever you have that underscore, it's going to camel case it. So it's going to be AL, it's going to be all capital examples without the underscore there, ALL capital E. I'll show you that in a moment. And what I'm saying here is Graphene list. I just want you to list every single example from that example endpoint. Just give me everything out of the model, and that's what we're going to spit, I don't know, into a list or table or something along those lines on the front end. And then whenever you define a call like that, you need to say what it's actually doing. So you just create a resolve underscore and then whatever you named it up front. So if I name this example, it would just be resolve underscore example, and then go from there. You might be looking at this and be like, there's no way this works. There's no way, it's too simple. That's too simple, but it's done. That's literally, that will get us all of our stuff out. And I will even prove it. I will show you in both the, essentially in a really quick instance I put up, and also in GRAPHQL, which I'll introduce you to as well. So here on the left, you can see I've got the import graphene statement. On the right, we've got our database model. The underscore string self thing, what that's doing is that's just telling Django in our admin model what to display out, or just in general, whenever we're making calls on that model, it's going to display the char value first as kind of a representation rather than a generalized model one. It's kind of like the name of each instance. That's getting too complicated. Don't worry about that part. You'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. But yeah, this is it. Here I've got my query defined. I'm exporting my query to Graphene, and you can see this is all running up in Django. And let's go to GRAPHQL. This is GRAPHQL, by the way. I wanted to introduce this here. It's a fantastic thing for whenever just launching and seeing what's going on with your endpoints, and I really feel like it is the killer app for GraphQL. Graphene Django basically builds this automatically for you. So if you go to the /GraphQL, once you have everything open, it runs automatically for you. It even has the documentation explorer, which is fantastic. So you can see here I've got no description yet, but description would be ingested automatically if I put it there. We've got our all examples call, and it uses example type, and we can see the values that are available in our example type. And watch this, voila, all examples. I'll grab the ID just because why not? And you can see how easy it is to use this. Run it, bing, got everything out there. It's that simple, and hopefully that blows you guys away. It blew me away the first time I came across it, and this is really, I feel like, the power of this particular architecture. You can get your models very quickly, ingest them, and then you're off and running. It's really good for building things very quickly. And just to show you what I was talking about with that def self, it's this here. So if I add another example, is showing off underscore self. Let's make that int value, I don't know, 2020. And look back at all these examples. So you can see that's what it displays as a result, or that's what it returns in default, and just showing you that in fact does go through here. Bing. Anyway, hopefully you guys are excited about this, and this encourages you to continue with the video series and get running. I will talk about in the next video a little bit more of some edge cases, specifically around logic on the back end and logic in the schema portion, and how I try to differentiate those and how that simplifies my life. And you guys can take that or leave it, or even just get off and running at this stage. And eventually I'll hopefully make a video of how to put this all together top to bottom, very simpler, and maybe even get a Docker container going. We'll see if I get around to that. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody.